If you've been looking around and you're trying to figure out what should I image next, stick around as we talk about the top 5 narrowband targets in the October sky. Welcome back, everybody. I am, of course, Mark with Midwest Astro, and today we're going to be talking about the top 5 targets in the October sky for you to either look at visually or take images of. So the first target is going to be the Veil Nebula. Now, you can image this much earlier than October, but it's going to be in the highest part of the sky at this point in the season, which means one thing for you: less atmosphere to look at. Now, all of these targets are going to be in the northern hemisphere, of course, but with the Veil Nebula, you will likely be able to see it in parts of the southern hemisphere as well. The entire complex is cataloged as NGC 6979. Now, there are parts of this nebula that have their own names and their own identifiers. Of course, the East Veil Nebula being the biggest portion with its own catalog code of NGC 6992. What does that mean to you? That means a couple things. We can either image this with an ideal focal length of about 135 millimeters, all the way up to multiple thousand millimeters, maybe 2 or even 3,000 millimeters. This target offers many different options. You can image this in narrowband or broadband alike. You're not limited to just one or the other in this particular case. You can do either. The nice thing is, if you want the entire complex, you can use something like a 135 millimeter camera lens or something like the ASCAR 135, and that will allow for you to capture a huge section of sky. The benefit is that you can see the entire remnants of this particular supernova. Now, you can also strap on something like an RC10, a C11, whatever it may be, and you can look at little areas of the nebulosity with great detail at a very long focal length. So this target is for both beginners and advanced users alike. The second item on the list today is going to be the North America Nebula. Now, I've done a video on the North America Nebula, so if you haven't checked that out, be sure to do so. I'll try to link it up here or put it down below, and take a look at it and let me know what you think of it. The catalog code for the North American Nebula is going to be NGC 7000, which is incredibly easy to remember, especially when it's like late and you're trying to just plan something. 7000 is pretty easy to remember. So give the North American Nebula a try. Now, the ideal focal length for this particular nebula can be anything from 135 millimeters all the way up to 2,000 millimeters. It's not limited or restricted. You can look at multiple different areas. Now, if you want the whole complex, 135 millimeters will probably be more recommended, but you can shoot an area of focus such as the Cygnus Wall, which, understand that the Cygnus Wall is just a named portion of the nebulosity within the North American Nebula. The Cygnus Wall doesn't have its own catalog code that I'm aware of, and when you refer to the Cygnus Wall, you're really referring to ultimately a part of the North American Nebula. Now, the Cygnus Wall itself can really be imaged at about 1,000 millimeters, which is excellent because there's an array of telescopes that are both relatively cheap or really expensive, depending upon what you have, that are in that particular range. I myself have shot this with a 10-inch Newtonian, which is 1,000 millimeters, and it provides wonderful detail. Obviously, the more aperture you have, the more resolving power, or the more light resolving power that you have, you can get the more faint details that can really pop, versus if you use something like the 600 millimeters, it's still going to be great, don't get me wrong, but you're not going to get quite as much light, because if you're in the 600 millimeter range, you're typically going to be closer to something like a 5-inch Apo triplet, for example. It is definitely a beautiful nebula, absolutely worth checking out. Let's move on to the next one here. Number 3 is the Elephant's Trunk Nebula. All of these nebulas seem to have an animal's name of some kind or some other means of we could recognize it and sympathize for what it looks like or what it should look like. The Elephant's Trunk Nebula, cataloged as IC 1396, is ideally shot between 300 or 1,000 millimeters. You can, of course, use way more than that, but you're not going to need to. The beautiful thing with this particular nebula is it's far away, but it's still close enough that even something like an 80 millimeter, Apo triplet or whatever it may be, a doublet, like a William Optic Z73 or even a Z61, can do a wonderful job with this particular nebula. Again, you can do the whole complex, or you can zoom in on just the trunk, but this particular nebula has other areas within it that are amazing, especially at long focal length, large aperture telescopes. You can get just these dark nebulae that are just blocking all light from exiting in that particular area, and it's gorgeous. So this particular nebula does offer some wonderful options, and you're not limited to just one telescope. You can use a multitude of telescopes or even a camera lens to capture this. The fourth target that we're going to talk about today is going to be NGC 7822. Now, this is the target that I myself have won a NASA APOD with. Obviously, its catalog code is NGC 7822. It doesn't actually have a name. It is informally called the question mark, or like the cosmic question mark, because of its particular shape. It does resemble slightly a question mark. I personally feel like that's maybe a little bit of a stretch. I don't see it as much as other people claim to. Now, this particular nebula is just like the elephant's trunk. Whether you're at 200 millimeters or a camera lens at 135 millimeters, this particular nebula offers a multitude or a variety of options. Again, you can use a camera lens and get the entire complex. You can get space itself, and then all of a sudden this gas just comes out of nowhere, and that's what you're going to image. Or you can do something like 1,000 millimeters again, or even 1,500, 1,600 millimeters, not a problem. Up to 2,000 millimeters for sure. Anything beyond that, it just depends on what your skies are going to allow. Before you might have too much telescope, right? If you have too much aperture and focal length together and your skies don't support it, you're really just going to be making a really zoomed in, blurry image. And that's not typically what you want to do. So with this particular nebula, it looks wonderful at 1,000 millimeters. You can get great details with a 10-inch telescope, but you can also get really nice details as well with something like a 5-inch or 127 millimeter apotriplet or doublet. So anything really between the 100 and 150 millimeters, if you're talking about a refractor, will do a wonderful job with this nebula. And then our fifth narrowband target for the month of October is going to be the Pacman Nebula. Now, I picked the Pacman because all of these other targets offer the ability to image them with almost any telescope. But the Pacman Nebula is going to require a little bit of focal length here. Now, I have shot it at 666 millimeters of focal length, but I'm going to personally recommend at least 1,000 millimeters of focal length. And the reason being is there's really small details in here that don't resolve well without a lot of aperture, but also you have to make sure you don't get too much focal length, or else you're going to start cropping in on this target. So 1,000 millimeters is nicely paired with something like in ZWO ASI 294mm, a 1600mm, any of those 4/3 sensors. The 533 might be a little bit small because in general it's a small sensor. So you might not want to do 1,000 millimeters, right? Because that's going to seem like you're shooting at a much longer focal length. You might want to stick to somewhere in the 700 millimeter focal length just to get the whole nebulosity in there. Now, with that said, if you do have a larger sensor, if you have much more focal length, of course, that gives you the flexibility to still see the whole thing at, say, 1,600 millimeters with something like maybe an RC8. Let me know what your favorite target is to image or look at in the night sky. Now, these targets are only deep sky, narrowband targets. We're going to do deep sky broadband targets, and we're not including planetary or lunar, because with lunar, you can do it almost 3 weeks of every month. It's not just the month of October, but we are starting to get Jupiter high in the sky, Saturn's rising. So planetary is on the rise. So if you are a planetary imager, by all means, don't just stick to this list. Go ahead and try to shoot those, especially because we're at opposition or close to opposition for both Jupiter and Saturn. So with that, thank you very much for watching. Again, let me know what your favorite targets are down below, and I'll be sure to add those next time around. Thank you for watching, clear skies, and we'll catch you next time.